I know I've seen some faces in here that look fairly familiar. Who saw this talk at Iowa Camp? Just one?
If you count standing out here in the window, it's full.
So 3. Well, that's good, because I was hoping that I could do something that was going to be repeated to many different people. So that's good that I've got a new audience. I've done this talk now actually 5 or 6 times this year, which is rather surprising. I just did this for the Twin Cities Co-Camp, and all of a sudden I've been asked to do this in a couple other places. So that's good. I've been able to refine it a little bit here and there. PowerPoint's IDE is not really good. Neither were some of my examples. So I've changed a couple of them around. So you're getting the version 2 or 1.1, however you want to see it. So my talk tonight is on writing better code, and specifically on using Visual Studio tools to help you write better code. So this talk is not necessarily about design patterns or when should I write code this way compared to this way. It's more of I have some code. What are some things, tools and techniques that I can use to make my code better? So it's going to be broken up into 3 parts. The first one is what? What is good code? And then also what is bad code? And the bad code is going to go through some examples, ask for your opinions on what you think is bad about it. Talk a little bit about why. Because I think the question of why should I write better code seems pretty easy to answer, right? It seems like a straightforward question. But I think it's worth some time to go over that question because a couple interesting statistics that I've heard about projects that we do on day-to-day experience. We're supposed to take a little 5-minute break here for the talk, so we'll do it right there. And once we come back, we'll go through the rest of the talk, which is how. That's going to go through a lot of examples of Visual Studio coding and whatnot. Okay. All right, first, the what. What is good code? When I put together the material for this talk, I thought of how could you define what good code is? And we could probably spend a day, if not a whole class, trying to define what good code is. So rather than taking that amount of time, I just put together a couple of bullet points that I think we can agree upon for the duration of the talk and say, yeah, that's reasonable for a definition of good code. The first one is readable, consistent coding style. And I hate to be negative off the bat, but I just got on a new project where this doesn't fly. And it is extremely painful. Because you'll look at the code base and you can see, I know this person wrote this code, and I know this person wrote this code, and I hope that I don't have to maintain this person's code or change it because it just stinks. It's horrible. It's really hard to read. It's not written like this person's code, which does a really good job. That speaks a little bit to experience. Somebody that has been doing it for 10 or 20 years will probably code, hopefully, will code a little bit better than somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience. But it's more about just doing things consistently, using the same naming conventions, using the same file structures, using the same way to define projects, and so on and so forth. If you have a consistency within your projects and solutions, that's one less thing that a developer has to do when they come into a new code base and go, why is it done one way here and another way here? It's at least consistent. If it's consistently bad, that's better than being, I think, inconsistently good across the board. It's better to see things that are readable. Resilient. Lots of unit tests and just testing in general. If you want to be able to not only change your code to make it better, because we've all written code and come back to it 6 months later and go, why did I write this way? You know, we all know that we learn as we get older and we see things that we did before and go, that wasn't the right way to do it. It's hard to be able to go into your code and make those changes if you don't have tests. Because how are you going to be able to know that your change is better but doesn't affect requirements that your clients have set up? If the client just says, hey, I had requirements this way, but now the business has changed and I want to do things in a little bit different way and I want to tweak things, I want to add things, if you have to make those changes, how are you going to know that those changes didn't adversely affect the rest of the code base? There have been a lot of times where you do the classic, I'm just going to change one little piece of code, and then that piece of code just adversely affects something else. If you have unit tests, if you have functional tests, whatever you want to call them, you'll quickly know if you broke something. One thing that I think is good about code is if you can fail fast on it. If you can know right away that you made a mistake, it's a lot cheaper to make that fix rather than going through a large project cycle development and getting to the end and going, we really screwed up. And then you have to make that fix there. It's a lot cheaper to fail fast. I'm going to keep reiterating that point tonight. And with tests, you can do that. You'll know right away when you have to fix something. Along with these two comes it's maintainable. It's a clean API, it's a consistent API. Microsoft has this tool called code analysis, which I'm going to go through tonight. It helps you create APIs that are consistent. There's also a book called Framework Design Guidelines, which a lot of things that they talk about are in the code analysis rules. And that helps you write things that when you look at code and you look at assembly and when you use it, at least the API has a consistent feel to it. And again, it's also easy to refactor. You can make changes in the future that are fairly painless. It doesn't cost the customer a lot of money to make those changes. So those are my 3 bullet points for tonight. I'm sure we could add other ones and argue about the ones I have here, but we're going to stick with these for now. But to really drive these points home, I think it's better just to look at some bad code. Because you learn a lot more from your failures than you do from your successes. And obviously, if you do something right, you're going to try to repeat it in the future. If you do something wrong, then it's really going to be itching your head never to do that again. When I was 16, I totaled a car. Okay? And at that time, half the time I was wearing a seatbelt, half the time I wasn't. How many times do you think I wear a seatbelt now after that day when I did it? Every single time I get in the car. That day I actually wore it, and after the crash and seeing a smoking car in front of me and a cracked windshield, it really drove in my head that I succeeded because I had a test and my seatbelt on. So from that point on, I wore it. But failing really badly etched in my head, you got to wear the seatbelt. So let's look at some bad code. I'm going to go through it. I want to get your opinions on what you think is bad about it, and then I'll go through what I see as bad about it. Now remember, this is PowerPoint. Its IDE is not very flexible, okay? But it's also very forgiving, so I can write code that maybe doesn't completely compile. Okay? I'm just trying to get a point across in about 5 lines of code. Okay? I'll try to give you some context from this stuff. And some of these code examples are actually mine, I have to admit. Not all of these are from examples I've seen from clients. Some of these I've actually written myself. In fact, the first one is one of mine. This is a piece of code that was in a method, and 2 of the arguments in that method is query, which is a string, and index, which is an int. What do you see wrong with it? Now, if you were at my talk before, don't blurt out the answers it displays. Let the other people figure it out. Any idea, just throw it out.
You might as well use placeholders for both of the parameters rather than doing concatenation for part of it.
I'm using string format, so then why am I using concatenation here? And I'm using the curly brace syntax here, the formatting. That's definitely not good style. I might as well use one concatenation or the other. Use a 0 and a 1 here.
Also, the fact that if there's any possibility of this being used by another culture, you could have some differences based on the culture there because you didn't include that.
If we're targeting internationalization, or we want to have those kind of issues addressed, the fact that I'm not making the caller to format it's set up so that you're passing in those extra parameters and information. That's true. That could be a problem. If this is just going to a logger file, though, that's usually going to be read by somebody of a certain culture. So that'd be that big of an issue.
Well, even if you set it for invariant,
True.
at least you know where it's going to, which way it's going to come out, no matter what the culture setting is on the laptop.
I hear your point. I'm going to give you even more of a hint. There's something that can actually blow up with this the way it's written. There's a very sneaky bug.
Index is null.
Where is null?
No.
Queries null.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, if it is, that wasn't what we found.
Does it just turn into an empty string?
I think it might. I'm not sure what string concat does if you pass it in. Because that's what this actually turns into under here is concatenation.
I think it throws an exception on their
You're right, test.
operation on
But that's not what we found. What we found is our little insidious bug is, what happens if the query value itself contains curly braces?
Oh, indexed is thrown in.
It gets all messed up. If query here had like hello curly brace world, this thing blows up. String format throws an exception because it's trying to parse this and it thinks that the first part of the string here should have 0 and then it also has some other curly braces and it doesn't know what to do with it, so then it just throws an exception. And we had this one bug showing up that said, we run this query and we're getting this really, we're getting the error page. And so we looked through the logs and we're like, what is going on? And we finally figured out that this value was containing curly braces. And then we went, oh, that's really stupid. What we should have done is what somebody said at the beginning. Just use 0 to 1 on string format and pass both values. And that fixes it. And it works fine. Yeah.
And shouldn't we, before you even work with this query, be doing some kind of injection?
Sorry, what?
Be doing some kind of injection check to make sure that no one.
This is the sequel.
Okay.
This is actually, that's a good point. If this was SQL and it was doing dynamic SQL, should I be defensive against the SQL injection? Yes. But this was just, the query here was actually MSN Live query. So that's all we were logging.
But still, I think his point's still valid, not necessarily injection, but you should be still doing data validation.
This is just logging to a file for debugging purposes. The weird thing is that for something that was innocuous as this, it actually ended up causing an exception that the client saw via going to an error page. So they just typed in a query and all of a sudden, we're sorry, we can't process your results. So even with us having tests around this, and we saw we had code coverage around our code, it still had an exception. It still had a bug in there. So even if you think you nailed something down, you may not have it perfect. There may be a case that you haven't thought of. There's actually a tool called PEX. It's from Microsoft Research that's basically a unit testing tool on steroids squared. Because what it does is it goes through your code and looks through all possible paths to see where it can break it. It's an amazing tool.
What was the name of it?
PEX, P-E-X. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but I saw a demo of it earlier this year at Microsoft, and it's amazing. They found a really obscure bug with Resource Manager using the Microsoft API. But it's something that you probably never, ever, ever get. And it's just cool to see how it traced it down. Here's another one. What would you say is wrong with this?
Too many values.
Too many what?
Too many values.
Too many values?
Well, you forgot
Power
exponent.
comma
The
value.
parameters don't
Instead of X, but
Right. Well, yeah, it's not that there's too many parameters, it's just that they're passed into his function wrong. Now, I've heard people when they see this slide, they go, why'd you even do this? Why did you wrap the math API? Okay. Because I've been at clients, especially if you've been coding for a while and you remember the days of Visual Basic and data access layers and people going, there was DAO and RDO and ADO, we just got to make our own access layer because Microsoft keeps switching it on us. So they wanted to make their own generic data access library and wrap whatever Microsoft came up with that month.
We wrap it because we're writing our own language.
That's another. I mean, I'm not saying there's invalid reasons for it. I'm just saying there are valid reasons why people do stuff like this. This is kind of a little bit of a joke. I mean, wrapping the power, the math API is a little, you can consider it a little bit ridiculous. The point I want to drive home is you have a function that looks nice. It's got, arguments that are named well, and the name of it goes power. So you should probably, assuming that this is part of a class called mathematics or something like that, you may be able to look at it and go, this is what I'm supposed to do. But internally, it's not doing the right thing. And this is to drive the point home of, if you don't have unit tests, you won't know that unless somebody tries to run it. With a unit test like this, you can see that if I pass in 4 and 3 to that method, I should get 64, and I'm not. And so you're going to be able to fail fast if you run these tests right after you compile your code. Next one. What don't you like about this?
Sealed.
I'm about to say, please, let's not go into the sealed argument, but you want there. I think it's a side point that some people really get passionate about. Do you seal by default, or in VB it's called not inheritable, or do you just leave that off? I'm on the camp that says you seal by default, but I don't want to go there right now. That actually, though, is important for the rest of this code, that it is sealed, because it affects the rest of the code. The name of the method should be
Well, you're never able to override the routing code.
well, if I didn't have it sealed and I had these virtual, then I would be able to. But even if I had it not sealed, because they're not virtual, I wouldn't be able to override them anyway. Even if I made that public or something.
And this is how your documentation.
This is the PowerPoint API. I have enough room. The hint of the method is that this is something that unless you did really bad things with the reflection API, you'd never be able to hit from a consumer perspective. Okay? Because it's a private method on this class. You can't inherit from it. So if it was protected, you wouldn't be able to hit it anyway.
Well,
If it was protected, you would be able to hit it, but it's sealed, so you can't.
But that's assuming that no one inside of that class calls routing code.
Right, but again, with 5 lines of code, I had to kind of try to.
Right, I realize that's what I'm saying.
So that's what you were.
It's not obvious, though.
Yeah, it's not used code. The point is that I've been on code bases where we're seeing lots of little fields that are never used. I was actually at one code base from a major credit card vendor, and I won't say their name. You probably have one in your pocket. That what they did in this system is, this was for disputes. Okay, you get your, you look at it on, looking at it either through mail or you look at it online and say, I didn't go to that store, I didn't buy those movies, I didn't do that. Who's taking my identity? So you go through your credit card company and say you dispute it. That's what this system did. Okay? And we had to take these files from the mainframe, load them up in the database, which had all the image data of the credit card transaction, all the information about it, and then when they use the system to do stuff with that transaction, then we write a file and go back to the mainframe. Okay? These files were in EBCDIC. Who here actually knows what EBCDIC is? A couple of people. Okay? There's EBCDIC and there's ASCII, and what we have to do is basically take these files, translate them into ASCII so that we can load them into the database. There were 3 sections in the code that had EBCDIC to ASCII conversion routines. Only one of them was being used. So every time you compile this application, there's just a little chunk of code in that executable or DLL that was just sitting there, never being used. But you look at it and you go, why is this here? And you have to go and trace and say, does anybody ever call this? Is it safe to delete? Okay. Another one that I love is, fix it simply, you just delete that. Another one that I love is when you go to a code base that has source control and you see about 50 lines of code commented out. And you sit there and you go, can I remove this? I mean, it's not going to do anything. It's commented out. It's not compiled in. But you still have this feeling of, can I get rid of this? Which is really funny if you're in the source control system. If somebody really wanted to keep that in there, go, well, we had that in there before. Okay, go back in history, find it, and then just bring that back up and merge it back in. Commented code is just hard for somebody who's new to an application to look at it and go, why is this commented up? So just another little stumbling block. Get rid of it. If there's something that you know you don't need anymore, remove it, especially if you're in a source control system.
It's not in a source control system.
Well, you can still remove it, but if somebody really wanted that code, then tell them to get some versions. What's wrong with this?
Not catching me.
Specific exception.
Well, I am catching exceptions.
You're catching
I'm
everything.
catching everything that could possibly come through. Okay, and that's really, really bad. Why? Why is this bad? Because I've seen people do this. I used to do it myself because it's really easy. Oh, I'm defensive coding. My application will never break, right? I've even seen a client, I wasn't there, but somebody Magenic was, that their standard was, okay, here's your method, here's all your code. Now, once you got that down, you put a try block around all that code, you put a catch block at the bottom that catches every exception, and you do nothing. That was their standard, because that was maintainable defensive
You
code.
do nothing.
Yeah, it would do nothing. The log, it wouldn't do anything. So what's wrong with this? I mean, any reason why this is bad?
You need to catch at a level where you can do something about it.
That's one. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there's lots of things that are wrong with
It's
this.
better to catch specific exceptions because you should know what kinds of exceptions you can possibly receive,
Right.
generally anyway.
Yeah.
Not 100%, but.
It's not always easy,
Not always
but
easy.
you should try.
From an app standpoint, you can get your app into a funky state, and you just don't.
Yeah. What this threw was a Stack Overflow exception? You really think you can recover from that?
We're gonna try.
But in 1.0 and 1.1, if this code in here, through a Stack Overflow exception, you catch it. 2.0 and beyond, you can't. Your application actually fails. It'll terminate. Which is actually a good thing, that your application should fail if you hit an exception that you can't handle, or that the runtime thinks you can't. Now, there's a way in configuration to override that behavior so it acts like pre-2.0 days.
Do you know why that was added?
Because they felt that you
Were too
really
many people
aren't
doing
able.
that?
I'm sorry,
Were too many people doing this? Were they
That's
trying to
part
just
of it.
force it?
But they also reason that it's just too hard for an application to say, if you hit a Stack Overflow exception, that you can reliably recover from
You just failed 1.1.
it. In 1.1, we actually get into the catch block. It changes in 2.0.
Not on great speed, I don't know.
Well, I would disagree, because I've got a blog post that shows this. You can 1.1, 1.1, you can, in 2.0 it doesn't. It doesn't even get into the catch block. In the try block here too, if you have, on the environment class, there's a fail fast method, it actually doesn't get into the catch block either. So why people do this is usually because they think this will catch everything, I'm being defensive. But in reality, do you think you could write a handler that could catch any possible exception? What about out of memory exception? What do you think you could do with that?
Go buy more readings. You know what that looks like a holdover from?
Yeah.
What's that?
Some of the old C++ days, where if you didn't have a catch block there, it didn't unwind the stack properly.
Okay.
Because you had to catch it in every procedure back up the stack. Or you lost memory on anything that was on the heap that was created in that procedure.
16-bit NFC.
How'd you guess?
I'll trust you guys on that. As he was saying before, Greg was saying is, you should try to catch specific exceptions that you know could be thrown by whatever code is in here, ones that you think you can handle. Like if you're trying to open a file and you try to catch a file on a file exception, that may be something that you can handle gracefully, show message user saying I can't find the file or something like that, and the application continues. Okay? But if that goes through an out of memory exception, that might actually be something that you can just say, I can't gracefully recover from it. Do the Visual Studio thing of restart the application in a new AXE space, so that hopefully we can get more memory back by killing ours, something like that. What about this? Other than I use the variable named D, which is highly undescriptive. If you've ever been on a code base that I've done, if you've ever looked at anything I've done CodePlex, I try to be a little bit more descriptive than X, I, D, and stuff like that. But that's not the issue here.
What's route doing? Are you gonna go out of scope?
I don't know. What is route doing? It's a public API. You purchase it. It just routes something.
Okay,
It
so
routes a message.
my first thought would be that if route continues to do something underneath, then you leave the function. Do you lose dispatch? Does it go on to the collection? Or no?
GC is run, yeah. And that after here, it's available.
You're not getting any resource there. It could only be a resource and you're not getting the once you're done with dispatcher responsible.
You guessed really good, or you've seen my talk before.
No, I'm not saying,
Because the point is that it's supposed to be not obvious. You're the first one to actually guess what the answer is. I'm amazed, actually. That's really good. If I had a gift, I'd give it to you. Because this slide has frustrated everybody. They look at it and they go, well, the variable's not named well. What does route do? Is it asynchronous? And they're trying to come up with all this stuff, and like, you're not getting it because the point is, you're never going to get it. You haven't seen the next slide. He was very prescient in his answer, which is, dispatcher is disposable. Okay? It's basically saying, I need you to do something to free up some resource, okay, or to do some cleanup. So,
Jason,
Yeah.
you can give him the geek mug over there.
oh, okay. Wait, what is this other shirt that has this binary?
I haven't translated it yet. I don't
You haven't
know.
translated it?
No.
Somebody, if you got a laptop, write the code for us. I won't throw it at you.
Ready to get going once you read it without.
So it's a disposable object. So what you should do is, in C# in VB, use the user. Okay. And then you're going to do the best thing that you can do, which is to call dispose on it and hopefully clean up the resources. But unless you're doing a code review or some type of tool to say, hey, maybe I'm missing a dispose call on something that is disposable, it's going to be really hard just to look at that piece of code and go, well, there's something wrong with it. Because as it stood, it was fairly innocuous. There wasn't that much wrong with it. Last one. What's wrong with this? Since you mentioned WCF, this is one that you have to have knowledge of WCF to see what's wrong with it. Or just be a really good guesser. Have a really good sense of intuition. If you actually read through it a little bit, it starts, you can kind of guess as to what the problem is.
How can you return string from this one?
Do you know WCF?
No.
Okay. Because he's right. In WCF, if you have an operation that has is one way equal to true, you can't return a value. Because as soon as the service gets the call going, so to speak, and says, okay, I'm going to process, because you pass in data, the client can disconnect and go off and do something else. But there's no way for that service that at that point is it's processing stuff over here, and it's processing stuff over here, for it to call back to you and say, here's your return value. Here's the bad thing, here's why I included it, because I got bit by this. C# will compile this just fine. It doesn't care about this. It doesn't have any special rules about WCF to say, this isn't an interface to say, you can't return a string here, that this has to be void. It'll compile just fine. But if you try to load this service up and try to run it, then you're going to get exceptions. So we were taught two lessons with this. One, we did this wrong, and we got to code it better. But the other thing was we need to unit test our services as well. So to fix it, again, a lot of things that you do wrong code usually is not always, but usually it's not that hard to fix, like this one. You just make it void, update your services, and away you go. But it'd be nice if you had something at compile time to say, did I screw anything up in the WCF world? And there's a way by writing custom rules via the code analysis API to catch things like this and let you know about it, even before you run unit tests. So those are my examples of what's bad code. And I'm sure people in this room have had experiences either with what you've written or what you've seen other people write and go, I hope I never do that again, because it's just not the right way to do it. Now, what about the why? Anybody read the daily WTF in your website?
Not daily.
Not daily, just weekly? I had a rim shot at you. The daily WTF, which stands for what the, you can figure out what the F stands for. I'm going to keep the family clean because I'm being recorded. It's dailywtf.com. As a side note, the guy actually tried to change the site to call it worsethanfailure.com, and he just got ripped for it. Like, oh, come on. We know what it stands for, just leave it like that. But it's a great site because he has horror stories on there from other people about projects they've been on. You got to read this site because it's very addictive. Some of these stories you just laugh at and go, Yeah, and I might have been there too, because it sounds oddly familiar. They also have code samples posted from sites on just some really awful ways of how to do very simple things. And I saw this as a comment on one of the posts, and I thought, that's just perfect. Okay. Because this addresses why I think it is so important that we try to write better code. Because we don't want to lose the will to live. You know? Why should we care? Why should we care as professionals? I've heard the statistic, and it's varied depending on what website you go to or when you hear it. But it's generally consistent that anywhere from 50 to 70% of projects, even of the current age, are failures. And I'm not talking about let's come up with this wild idea, 2 weeks later we go, oh, it's not going to work, well, let's just name it twitter.com and release it. You edit that. The fail whale. But it's not the thing where you try out a really interesting idea and you go 2 weeks, a month later and go, that was really the wrong approach. Let's just fail that right now and let's try doing something else. Because that's not a very costly failure. It's we're going to charge on for a year or two, no matter what happens, and at the end of 2 years, it's going to work. I've seen projects that people have been on with Imagenic where it's just go. You're gonna succeed no matter what. In 2 years, we're going to be done, and they end up being just failures. So, I personally don't like being on projects like that. I know people that are on projects like that it just ends up being miserable. So why should we care? We're professionals, We put a piece of toast in a toaster, we don't expect to get killed every time we toast our toast, bread, right? So we hope that we run a code that every time they put in an entry into a text box that would cause the whole application to fail. I've had to maintain one like that. Okay. That's just not fun to be on a project like that. Okay, so we're professionals. We should try the best we can with the knowledge we have to write as good as code as we possibly can. We want to go home on time. We're like staying in the office at 1 in the morning trying to figure out a really weird, obscure bug because the client wants it to work the next morning. You're raising your hand. Oh, you're getting your napkin. Nice recovery. I've only had to, I feel like I've actually been very fortunate in that I've only had to do the really late night stress affairs a couple times in my career. But the only times that I've been there, I didn't want to go back there. The last project that I was on, before I got on the one I'm on now, the last day, because I've been there a year and a half and I'm a consultant, so they want to give me something like, can you re-architect the whole app type of idea, because I don't have a day to do it. So they said, well, we got this bug. Can you work with this guy because he's having a hard time fixing it and just see what you can, throw your 2 cents in with him? Sure. So we go over and we start working on it. And our code coverage is actually pretty good. It was like 80-85%. But the one library that he was having a hard time with contained all of our HTTP modules. And that had 4% coverage. So we did the classic, well, let's change this. I think that'll work. Change it, recompile, smoke test the website. Yeah, that works, but now something else broke. Okay, let's go change this. And so we change this piece of code. We run it, recompile it, and then that would work, but then what we just fixed is broken again. And we literally did this for 2 hours. And finally I just said, my last day, I'm done. And I walked away. Not that bad, but I kind of just said, eventually you're going to figure this out, And I'm kind of on my last day, so I just slipped away. But that's no fun. I mean, that was very frustrating compared to the other debugging experience that I had on my project where if you fix something, you knew right away whether it was good or bad. Along with that goes less stress. If you're working on a death march project, for a project that just has this awfully bad code base, over time it just grinds on you, it wears on you. The stress just starts sticking with you because you have to go back to this job every single day and work with this code base. It's just not good at all. And we all want the less stress. Better customer satisfaction. That last project I was on was the first time that I heard directly from a customer come up to us and say, you guys got something done so fast, and it is very reliable compared to other projects I've been at this company. You guys did a really good job. That is such a pick-me-up to hear that as a developer. to get that direct feedback from the customer. When you try to do something as using unit testing and code coverage, and then you see those results come back from the client with a message like that, that's very encouraging. And it's just the other thing of what do you want to do with the rest of your life when you do go home and work on whatever projects you have. You get to have that diverse experience in your life, and you get to do other things other than coding, unless that's all you do when you go home is you work on open source projects and speak and travel. But I like golfing. I like doing other stuff like biking. It's nice to be able to come home and be able to do stuff. And I'm sure you all have your own hobbies. So it's what we do. The more we can try to write better code, I think the better off we are, not just in the professional world, but in a personal world as well. So that's enough philosophy. We'll take a 5-minute break, and just 5 minutes, and then I'll get into all the juicy how details.
Oh, I just wanted to get
I've gone over on this topic so many times. I get rushed in, so just let me know where I'm at.
Yeah, it's solid. 40 minutes.
So here's the how. This is where we're actually going to get out of philosophy and get to something that's real world. What do you do with the PH in philosophy you teach? What do you do when you code? You actually go and work something. So this is the how. How do you actually go about writing better code? What we're going to talk about is coding standards, unit testing, code coverage, code analysis, and code metrics. All of these are covered in some way tangentially in Visual Studio. Okay. I've usually gotten through the first 3 in the talk. The last 2 depends on how much argument I have in these first 3. But these are the ones I really want to cover. These other 2 are kind of, well, the 4th one I do, the 5th one it's like a 1 slide anyway. So let's get to it. Coding standards. To me, what a coding standard is it's a contract that all developers adhere to each other. So you have a group of 5 people. It's basically 5 people saying, this is how we're going to structure our files. Okay? We're going to have methods here, we're going to have fields here, fields are going to be named this way, so on and so on. Very simple. But this speaks to the original bullet point I had about things being consistent. If files look the same across the board in the project, that's one less thing you have to look at and go, why is it done differently? It should be short. I shouldn't have to take a book like this. Well, Greg's an exception, he does need a book like this. But put a book in front of him and say, this is the coding standard in our project, follow it. Nobody's going to be able to do that. Even if the book is good, during my Java days, there was a little thin 100-page book. It was green. It was called, I think, Java Coding Style or something like that. It was really nice, but even something as small as that, you're not going to remember everything there is in that book. You just, unless you have just a photographic memory, you're not going to be able to do it. So keep it short. I've been on a project where we had those big Post-its. You seen those? We had like our manifesto, which was an agile project. We had that on one page. On another page, we had our coding standard. And what there was is just a couple bullet points and then a code example. And that code example answered all of our questions. How should we name our fields? Should they have an underscore in front of it? Where should the fields go in the file? Just look at the example. That showed how you should do it. Okay? They can be very short. You don't have to spend a lot of time on a coding standard. This should be followed. Again, it's consistency. If somebody's doing M underscore for a field in one spot, and somebody does Pascal casing in another spot, why? Do it one way or the other, and just agree upon it. Okay? And people should be professional enough that you don't bring out your boxing gloves because you want to do it this way. And everybody in the project says, no, we want it. This is actually wrong. Fields by the Microsoft standards should be camel cased. But let's say everybody else project said we're going to do it this way. Okay? You should not be pulling out your gloves and wanting to go into a cage match because everybody else on your team doesn't want to do it your way. Okay? But I've seen people on projects that get really hyper when they don't get their coding standard way. And they're usually the ones that you ask, well, how would you do it? Nah, I don't care. Okay, we're going to do this way. And they get up, and just, they get their sword up and ready to fight. Okay? Just agree upon it. Go home and do your open source projects the way you want them to. But when you're on a team, try to be consistent. That being said, even if you have a really small, concise coding standard, you're still going to forget stuff. I was on a project where the coding standard was, this was J++, if you actually remember that. this isn't a J++ screenshot, but you see the coding example. What we were supposed to do is put the opening curly brace over here. Same thing with meta. Okay? That was their standard. Nobody in the team liked it. Nobody did it that way. But we're like, fine, we'll just do it. Okay? But we forgot. So we did 2 weeks of work for them. They did a code review and they looked at everything. And also we saw a message go to basically the head senior CEO developer guy in this project from a junior developer saying these Magenta guys don't know what they're doing because they didn't put the curly brace over here. Now, was he right? Yes. We didn't follow the standard. We did it wrong. We should have put it over here. Did that cause their code to massively fail? No. Was it an easy fix? Yes. But those are just little things that you forget. Even if you've done coding for 5 or 10 or 20 years, you may just forget to keep it consistent that way. So how in Visual Studio can you use tools to keep things consistent? That's the first demo. So when I did this talk the first time, I did the coding live and I realized it takes too much time, so I've got everything pre-canned. But it's the same example. It's going to be all about beers. I put the material together for the first talk. I'm like, what did I talk about? You have customers, you have the person, project, I'm like, well, I'm going to do something a little bit more closer to home. And then I went, I really want a beer. That's what we're going to do my code on. So,
It's really shocking coming from you.
yeah, it is, especially since I grew up in Wisconsin. So, what this beers project has is a beer-based class with a description, and we'll get more into what this code is all about, but I want to use this example to show what happens if the coding standard was what I just mentioned before. This should go here, and this should go here, and that should go there. Okay. Well, that was a lot of typing. I don't like typing. I want to preserve my hands for as long as I can, or specifically my wrists. So how would I change this? You can go up to Tools, Options, and once that loads up, you go down into the text editor. And C Sharp, and under formatting is where you can do this stuff. Now you'll see there's 5 examples on all other sort of formatting issues you can do in your code. I forget where exactly it is. I think it's in the new lines. There we go. Okay. So what you can do is, for all these options, you can either turn them on or off. Now you notice as I'm clicking on them, the coding example underneath is changing. So you can see what it would look like with that either enabled or disabled or whatever the option is. So I'm going to turn it off for this one in methods. I know I did the namespace one, but I'm just going to do these 2 for now. I'll say OK. And my code still looks the same. Didn't know how to format it. It can. What you have to do is either use the menu option, Edit, Advanced Format Document, which is in C# world, Control-ED. I like using as minimal keystrokes as possible, Control-ED. And I actually did the namespace one, because the namespace is actually part of the class name. So it reformatted it for me. Okay. Control-Z to get it back. Now I'm just going to change my options here because I don't like that standard. But you can see how you can change just a couple things so that as you're either opening up old code that didn't follow standard, you can just switch it that way. Or if I was typing new code, like if I said public, well, now I turned them off, so it's not going to do that. But if you type in new code, it would auto-format it for you that way, depending upon how you configured the IDE. Now that's my PC. Of course, if it works on my PC, that's good enough, right? It works on my machine, ship it. Well, how do I ship what works on my PC to other people's machines? Under Tools, there's also an Import and Export Settings option. And what you can do here is say, okay, I've got the IDE set up so that this follows our coding standards. So I want to export those settings. And now you can be selective in here and pick and choose what you want to select for this from your settings. Once you get that done, you can say, here's my settings file. Distribute that across the team. They'll do the reverse and say import settings, and then they can import those. And then everybody's got the same formatting styles for Visual Studio. Now, if you want to pick somebody else's styles, like you'll notice I have, let's call it the dark or the black view for my coding window. It's the black background with the color text or the white text. For some reason, that just works better on my eyes. And I got this. This is actually called Vibrant Ink, which I guess is a style in VI or EMAC world, which I don't live in. But I like the look. And there's a guy by the name of John Lamb, who's the Iron Ruby guy, who's championed this. And I loaded it up, and I went, this is really cool. But I made the mistake of loading all of his settings up. And all of a sudden, my entire IDE, like almost all those dockable windows, just went poof away. And they only show up when you do a compilation. When I did a compilation, then all of a sudden they got really big, and I'm like, I don't like this. So I had to restore the original settings and only pick out the fonts and color settings. That's what I really wanted. It's also nice if you do talks. You'll notice that not just my coding window, but all the windows, the fonts are bigger. It's just nice when you're presenting to have a little bit bigger fonts in there, but not just the coding window. Everything in there is bigger. Once I got that set up, I just export that settings file, and then I import that before I do a talk. Makes it really nice to reconfigure. Yeah.
How much of your settings here that you're showing us on the how is based on Team Server or versus Pro?
For Visual Studio, what's the difference? This is going to come up a lot tonight. What am I showing is different between a professional version and a Team Suite version, or the whole kit and caboodle. I think those options, and I can't say for certain, but I think these options should be in the professional version as well.
Okay, I just saw something that said Team ARM going, whoops. Better ask.
Yeah, and it's a good question, because I do run, I think, the team system for developers. So that becomes a big question we get into unit testing, which is next. Because there are some things that historically have only been in certain versions. All right, no arguments about M underscore?
Should always
We'll talk about that over beers later. So we're getting unit testing now. So what is unit testing? Like a lot of things in the world, everybody has a different definition. So I went to the source of truth called Wikipedia, and I looked at what it was. I guess Google's actually released their own encyclopedia. Did they just release that, the beta version? What's it called?
No.
No?
KNOL.
KNO, that's right. But that's supposed to be like Encyclopedia Britannica. It's only like a couple people, and it's controlled, right? It's not like Wikipedia that's open. So this is what I grabbed that day off of Wikipedia, and it seemed like it made sense. Since unit testing is a procedure used to validate that individual units of source code are working properly, that's the emphasis I want to get across. Because you can write a lot of unit tests, but if you're not actually exercising the code and making sure that it does what your customers have set as requirements, then they're fairly useless. I really look at unit tests as being an extension of the compilation process. You compile your code, great. Immediately run your unit tests. Do they follow what your customer said they should do? So it's the best that you can. Yes, okay, now you're good, or you're better. So that's how I view unit tests. At least that's one of the things that I see as unit tests. This year is 2008, and I'm starting to see unit testing become more and more of you just do it. More than I saw 5 years ago. 5 years ago was the first project that I was on that formally did unit testing. And at that time, I was of the mindset of, why are we doing unit tests? It's more code than we're supposed to be doing. This is a waste of time, blah, blah, blah. It takes a unit test just saved my butt moment before it clicks and goes, this is why unit tests are effective. I've had that moment. I was on a project where I was the lead on it, and somebody was, like I was, fighting me. Why are we doing unit testing? This is taking so much time. And I came in one morning, and as soon as I get in and I'm logged in, messenger pops up, and he comes up and he says something like, dude, what? He goes, unit test just saved, and then he says some words that again wouldn't be kid friendly, but of this nature. He had just changed something that morning that drastically broke everything. But before he checked it in, he ran his unit test and he went, oh yeah, I really messed up. And he's able to make sure that he fixed it before he checked it back into the source control tree. That's where unit tests, I think, are really effective. It lets you change stuff and see what you broke, or even if you didn't break it. I just put on my blog I just put an example about this thing I call Scope Switcher, which is this little utility that allows you to change any value in a property, and then once the using was done, it changed that property value back to the original. Okay? Think of a cursor in WinForms. You can change it to the way cursor and back again, but it was generic for any type. So I looked at my link query and said, why did you use first? Why did you use first or default when you're trying to find that property? And I thought, this is a perfect example of why unit tests are good. So I looked at my code and said, why don't you do it this way? Because then you can eliminate a try-catch handler in your code. But my unit tests shouldn't break. If I change an implementation and make it better, things should still work from a client perspective. That's what I see as beneficial about unit tests, among many other things. But how do you get this in Visual Studio? Now, what I'm going to be using is the unit testing framework that's within Visual Studio. In 2005, this was only available, to your question, in the team editions. It was not available in the professional or express. 2008, this is now in the professional version. My opinion, Microsoft isn't listening, is that it should be just like MS Build, just like any other part of the framework, it should be everywhere. Hopefully in the next version of Visual Studio or the .NET framework, it is there for everybody. But be that as it may, if you're doing stuff with Express, this doesn't come with it. So, how do you do testing? Well, let's just go through the code that I have, and then I'll show you the tests. Some people may say, well, should you write tests first? Should you do tests after? I'm not really going to get into that right now. I'm not getting into the philosophy of testing. I just want to show you more. How do you get them in? How do you run them? What happens when you add a test problem? So, again, the beer class is very straightforward. I have a couple of implementations. My favorite is Newcastle. Keep that in mind, Greg, if you want to buy me one tonight. Just saying. Then I also have I got Blatz, but I also got Duff. Can't get enough of that Duff. I also have Blatz, which for growing up in Wisconsin, I heard that many times, and of course you can tell I don't really like Blatz. Those are my three beers. Okay? And I created a enumeration to say what are the manufacturers for these beers. Now, I have a beer factory class here. This is the standard kind of factory pattern that you'd see in the golf book, Gang of Four book. Yes, this is spelled wrong. We'll come back to that later. But all I do is pass in which manufacturer I want to create me a beer. And then it just does a simple switch statement on it. It says for Newcastle, create Newcastle, Duff, create Duff, Blatz, create Newcastle. And that's wrong. I should be getting back a Newcastle. All right, I should be getting back a Blatz. Actually, this is a win in other areas. If somebody has a Blatz and they get a Newcastle back, so much the better. But coding-wise, this is not following the standards. So, so how would I know that? If I compile this and it progresses and I get to the end after it compiles, I'm getting failures because of code analysis. For now, I'm just going to ignore these. When I get to the code analysis part, we'll get back to this stuff. Okay. But it actually compiled. If I recompile it, it's going to work just fine. But how do I know it failed? Well, add the tests. Now, how do you add a test project in Visual Studio? It's actually fairly easy. I already have it here. What you do is you just go, you can right-click, you can go under File, New, Project, however you want to get there. Whatever it takes is you say Add, New Project, and then the screen you have a test project. That's it. If you actually look in the .proj file, whether it's VB or CS, and you compare it to a regular project file, there's a couple of little GUIDs in there that basically tell Visual Studio, this is a test project. Look for test methods. That's really what it's doing. Okay. So I've got my test projects in my application. A couple things you'll notice is that when you add a test project, it will add a unit test 1.cs file, so it shows you how a test file is set up, or the tests are set up. It also makes a TXT file telling you, here's how you do testing. You can delete those. It does add this VSMDI file and also this local test run config. This is what you can double click on and change a couple things in Visual Studio for the project setup. And I'll come back to some of these later on, especially the code conversion. One thing that you see on the screen is the test run naming scheme. What MS Test is actually what's called in Microsoft world. Will do is when you run a test in Visual Studio or a set of tests, it basically takes all of the DLLs and EXEs and everything else for that project and stuffs them into a results directory. So if you look down here, here's my test results, and here's all the artifacts that were created when I compiled for those tests. Now in 2008, I think it defaults to only keeping the last 20 or 25. In 2005, it would never delete these. So if you weren't careful and you ran a lot of tests, all of a sudden you're like, why am I running out of hard drive space? That's why. If you had a lot of code being compiled, it just kept on adding on. But this is nice because you can load these instances up back in Visual Studio as a historical perspective and say, well, I did this like 2 hours ago and now I did this, if you want to look at what was there before. All right, so assume I got the test project in there now. Let's write tests. We got some in there. Most of the stuff that you're going to be using when you write tests are within this namespace, and that assembly is automatically referenced for you here. You create the test project. Any test that you have has to be in a class that is attributed with the test class attribute. If you've done NUnit, this should be fairly familiar because it's almost identical, if not very identical. I've actually seen people that have taken NUnit code with a couple of pragma switches, I think that's what they're called, and make it so that it's very easy to do these as MS tests with very little work. But within a test class, any method that has a test method attribute on it is going to be is able to be run by the testing flow. So in this case, I have a test for creating Duff, and you'll notice in here I use the assert class. Assert has a bunch of methods on it. Most of what you're going to use are equal. Okay? Where I'm saying when I create that beer, I'm expecting that it has a description of this. You can also use is true, is null, is not null. There's a bunch of different methods on the assert class. But that's what you use to say, I expect when I call something or do something, I expect it to work this way. Now to run this, in 2005, it was actually a lot harder than you'd think. There's a third-party add-on that I'd use when Visual Studio first came out to use NUnit in Visual Studio, and it was called Testdriven Net. It's a great add-on. It's no longer free. You actually have to pay, I think, $100 to use it now. It's free if you're like basically a hobbyist developer. If you're working for a company, you're not a hobbyist developer, so they expect you to shell out some money for it. But it's a great add-in which gave you the ability to right-click and say Run Test. If you can believe it, before 2008, Run Test wasn't there. There's no right-click and just say Run the test. They've finally added that. They haven't added the debug test under that, though. So the way to get them both to run from the keyboard, a run test is Control-R-T. Debugging a test is Control-R, Control-T. Again, that's in C# world. I'm not sure if they're the same in VB, but I'm pretty confident they have some similar keystroke macros in there. Okay. So if I run a test here, it's just going to run this. If I say run test on a class, it's going to run all the tests in that class. If I say run test on a namespace, it's going to run all the tests that are within that namespace. So let's actually do it on the class. RT, run these tests, and then you'll see down here it pops up a test results window. And once it gets all these running, one of them failed. And the one that failed is the Blatz one. If I go click in there, basically, let me go back to that window, it says line 26 is where it failed. That's one thing that I don't like about this tool is that it doesn't line up exactly with where it failed. It actually fails on here because the type that comes back is not Blatz. It's a Newcastle. But I know something failed here. So I'll go into this code here and say, well, if I pass in the Blatz, that's the problem. It should be returning Blatz. Okay, so if I run this method again, I'm just going to run this one. And now it should succeed. So that's like the crash course on unit testing in Visual Studio. Anybody have any questions, comments, philosophies on unit testing, anything?
Do you actually use MS Test?
Yes. Do I use MS Test? Yeah, I do. Primarily because in 2008, with the integration it has with other tools, it's right out of the box. You install it, it's all there. When Visual Studio first came out, I used NUnit, NCover, FXCop, which was not part of Visual Studio, NAND for building, all the N stuff that they poured over from the Java world. So, and it's still available if you want to use those tools. Some people absolutely hate MS Test for many reasons. It's always worked for me on the projects I've been on. It's never been huge stumbling blocks. That's just my personal experience. But there are other testing frameworks out there that you can use if you want.
What about in cases where you either need a mock object or you end up going out to databases and or other external devices?
So what do you do for mocking? Microsoft doesn't have anything out of the box for mocking. And what he's getting at with mocking is, let's say I have to hit a web service from Microsoft. That's what our code depends upon. Well, in your unit test, you don't want to hit Microsoft every single time, or some other web service or resource that you really don't have control over. So what you'll end up doing, what's becoming more in vogue these days, is to mock this, which is somehow to, instead of hitting it directly, pass in a mock version of it that, say you pass in a value 3 or whatever it is, you expect that it will give you back this data, or you expect that you should have certain calls going on during a test. Mocking is a whole session in and of itself. But there are no tools directly available in Visual Studio to support mocking. Maybe in the next one.
So you got to go out and hit the database or whatever other resource it is and get the response?
Yeah. Or you can mock it. You can use, or you can write your own mock object or use another mocking framework. There's MOQ, there's Rhino mocks, there's TypeMock. All those have different features and pricing availabilities. But those are the three that I know of that you can use. And I'm kind of expecting, like NUnit, NAND, these things are eventually going to somehow become part of the Visual Studio .NET framework world. They might come up with their own mocking framework in a couple of years. Yeah.
What I have seen is when you're writing unit tests, if you have public classes, it's okay. I mean, you can write the unit test. If you have internal classes, you should use lot of reflection code to write a unit test. Does this automatic test write reflection code for you if you have internal classes?
If you have, this gets into the question, you're asking if you have an internal class, or if you have stuff that's basically not public, what can you do to hit those methods or hit those implementations?
You have to write some reflection code.
There's a couple things you can do. There's an attribute called internals visible to, and if you put that at the assembly level in the assembly that contains those internal classes, you can say, for example, I have my beers assembly. I can put an internals visible attribute in the beers assembly to say I trust beers.tests. And then what that basically says to the .NET framework is if code's coming from beers.tests, it can actually then reference the internal classes. Now that's just internals. Private, that doesn't work, but the internal classes it will. Generally for non-public stuff, I'm of the philosophy that you should look at it as a black box. You should just try to hit the public APIs in your unit test, and those should drive to the private implementation paths. There is something called private object that comes with the Microsoft testing framework. I think actually, if I just type it in, it should give me that telsense on it. Yeah, private object. And what that does is it just acts as a proxy to an object, and it makes, you don't have to write all the reflection code. It makes it a lot easier to say, I want to set this property value, or I want to call this method. And you don't have to do as much of the reflection gunk as you would normally do. You just have to pass in like a string and a value, and it figures it out for you. Yeah.
I work at a pretty small company. Is there a way, like, the lead guy adheres to RAD, like rapid application development?
Okay.
So he seems to be pretty anti-unit testing or any kind of testing for that matter. So I guess, do you have some like good resources for that anybody can say, this is why you need to do this, or, I mean, I would assume I can't just say, here, we need to write unit tests for everything now, because, I'd be laughed at, so.
Well, I just asked him then to see, how do you know your code's reliable in that type of environment? And it's not just unit testing,
Can I say something? Sure. There's a couple books by Steve McConnell who's wrote tons of books about this stuff. But typically, like when Jason says fail fast, if you can fail, like at the moment he's writing a test and fail, he can fix it right then and there. A bug that makes it to production is like 10 to 25 times more costly to fix then. So if you're writing stuff because you don't have time to test it, you're going to waste 10 to 25 times longer fixing that bug later on.
You know what's ironic is that McConnell also wrote a book called Rapid. But it's right, there's actually a chart in that Code Complete book that shows the cost it takes to fix a bug at local machine time basically to production time. And it just rises and rises and rises.
I was gonna say, if my memory serves me right, it's almost an exponential curve
Almost
on the curve, on
it's
the
like an
cost
order of
factor.
magnitude as you go up.
Well, you could just embed a bug and then make a unit test that finds it that he couldn't find.
That's insidious.
That would work. Yeah.
What was your name again?
So in some ways,
My mind
like,
blacklist.
when you say you don't have time to test, you don't have time not to test.
Right.
See, I could say that, I mean, it sounds nice, but.
Here's the thing, I mean,
Companies don't measure those hidden costs though, so they hire.
Yeah, well, I know, that goes back to Jason's thing about being a professional. Yeah.
I mean, well, I know you're kind of like doing this because it is a frustration. I mean, I used to work for a consulting company that, one of the things they did is they had a 2-day training course in project management. It's a big company that starts with a K. You probably, if you work for them or know them, you probably know what I'm talking about. That course was actually really beneficial because I'm a software developer. I don't do project management, at least I did at the time. And the guy that taught the course that day actually did a really good job because you talk about the principles and then you get nailed with questions from like 20 developers in the room going, well, what about this? What about this? He handled them very good. But like at the middle of the second day, he finally just said to somebody's question, he just said, I never said project management was easy. And in your case, you're hitting something that's how do you change somebody's mindset? It's not impossible, but it's not easy. If somebody's convinced that this is just not going to be worth the time and the effort, it almost takes that moment of, we've got people sitting around till 2 in the morning coding, we've got 50, 60 hours of overtime. I mean, he doesn't care because he's probably going out golfing. But,
Well, it's salary too, so he doesn't care if it's over 40.
yeah, it's at some point, I've heard people say that, how far do you take it before you finally just say, I give up, and that's somewhere that's really hard to answer, that you just can't for a person, But if you can't convince somebody that this stuff is beneficial, and they're just not going to buy into it, it becomes not an easy answer as to what you do at that point. Because I've done this now for 5 years, and I used to be of the mindset of it's not worth it. Why would you do this? This is over effort. This is way too much code that we're actually not running on the production buttons. But this has saved me so many times that I can't even count. Just by unit testing. I'm not even saying you have to do the whole agile thing, which I still like. But if there's one thing you pick out of it, it's unit testing. If anything, just tell them to appeal to authority. Hey, I heard some guy talking and it's really good. And you can give him my name and I can try to convince him. But it is really hard. I mean, you almost have to just do whatever you can to try to show them that there is a benefit and a worth. Come to Google Agile unit testing and see if there's any people that have, look at the people that have said it sucks and where the people that said it's beneficial. I say the ratio is probably way over on the beneficial side. So, but it's not an easy one to champion when you're running into people like that, especially if they're saying don't do it. I've heard people ask me, well, if you're on a project like that, do you do subversive unit testing? Meaning, you only do unit testing on your box, just to make sure that you have some measure of defense against changes. You can do that, but that almost becomes even more work than it's worth. Because what was if other people aren't following it, then also you get a whole slew of changes that you don't have testing over, and it almost becomes
Coverage isn't good.
yeah, exactly. So
It also depends on what where their background is. If they're a bean counter, cost is probably gonna work better than, reliability of code and stuff.
All right, so that's unit testing. Code coverage. Okay, so you have unit tests. I know I'm running over, but give me about 15 more minutes because I want to get through a couple more of these. So you have unit tests in place. Now what? How do you know that they're effective? I was on one project where we didn't really have any metrics other than we had unit tests. So the guy tried to put this thing up. Let's get the number of unit tests compared to the number of lines of code that we have. And I said, no, that doesn't make sense. But how do you measure that your unit tests are good? One of them is to look at how much code is covered. If I have thousands of unit tests and 10% of my code is covered, I'm doing something wrong. You're not hitting everything to make sure that it's working correctly. And if you have code coverage, you can look and say, well, do you need it? Is it dead code? Is it rotting code? Can I just remove it because nobody's hitting it anymore? Or probably not. And just get rid of it. Or do I need more tests? Do I need to find out other paths to drive to that piece of code to make sure that it's covered in the test? I just have some numbers of some projects that I have on Codeplex to show that I don't always get 100%. Some of these are 0. This is actually a wind farms project. This is a reflector-based project that before I figured out, in this one, how to unit test code based on Reflector's API, I just left it as 0 and I test by smoke testing. I run the app and see if it works right. This one actually has tests, so this one's eventually going to get, I think I said that in the Iowa Code Camp. I'm eventually going to revisit this when I find time after watching 2 kids at night. But some of these projects don't have enough coverage. So what's a good number? I would say 80%. That's the ballpark I try to hit on a project, is to say if I'm getting 80%, that's a reasonably good number. And other people may have different numbers. That's just a rule of thumb metric I keep in my head. Obviously, the more you get, the better off you are. If you can get 80%, I think you're doing fairly well. So how do you find out what your numbers are? If I look at my tests here, and I'm not going to do this last one here because it has to do with the WCF services. These 3 tests test my beers assembly. Let me run those, and I should get passing on them. And because my windows are so big, you usually see the icon in the toolbar here. It drops down here, and show code coverage results. Okay, and then you move over to this window. You can drill through there and say, well, how much is being covered? If you know it's the test one, 100% is covered, but in the actual assembly I'm targeting, only 90% is covered. You can actually drill all the way down to say, well, which class is it that doesn't have the code covered? And not in that class, but which method, not in which method, but it gives you color coding to say what isn't being hit. Sorry if you're colorblind, I apologize, but here, this color for the break is different than the other ones. That's basically saying it hasn't been covered. Now here's a little trick. This is actually default behavior for enumerations. You actually read the framework guidelines, they'll say that you should always have a default for enumerations, even if you knew you only defined like these 3, because that's being defensive against future changes. Okay. But how do you test that? You put another value in for the enumeration to say, that's the one I want to pass in. That gets ugly because now you have this extra enumeration around. People go, why is that there? What you can do is, let me turn off the color coding here. These methods I have commented out, is you can actually cast an integer value to that enumeration type, and that actually works. So what this will do is it will cause that default code to be executed. So let me go to my test view, grab all 4 of these methods, run them. And now I got my 4, go to my code coverage tab, and now you see that I have 100% covered for that assignment. To enable it, you have to go into this test run config file and go under code coverage and have the assemblies that you want to have covered checked here. And then you'll get the code coverage numbers on those assemblies. I also usually have my test assemblies clicked as well, just because the test code should also be run pretty much at 100% whenever you do a successful test run. If you only have 80% run, you're probably going, why would that happen? So that may be a little indicator to say, all my tests are passing, but why isn't all my test code passing? Any questions on code coverage and how you get those numbers? If you're also using something like CCNet or TFS, the results from the code coverage, I think, is in XML format, so you can parse it and get all pretty graphs and bars from it, so you can show it on the website. All right. I think I got, what's the one after this, and I'm going to finish up. Code analysis, yes. I want to go through this quickly, and then I'll finish. So you got unit tests, you got code coverage. Code analysis is basically a way to say, I have standards, but they're not just coding standards. There may be rule standards that say WCF one-way operations should not return a value. Maybe some other standards that say you should never use HTTP context in this overridden method or something like that. But that's not stuff that a compiler is going to be able to figure out. What code analysis gives you, which is FXComp, that's integrated in with Visual Studio, is a way to, instead of following all these manual processes and rules, which is not easy, it's just hard and annoying, is to use an analysis tool to find things like this to say you're not following these standards. These aren't bugs. They're just things that are suggestions to say you might want to change your code because it probably will make it better. If you turn on code analysis in a really big project, it's going to be daunting because you're going to all of a sudden see hundreds of warnings, or if you haven't turned them on as errors, it'll give you all these errors and say, you didn't name this right, you didn't do this right, you didn't name this correctly, you don't have this done right in your code. And I've seen a very junior team get overwhelmed by the information that comes back from code analysis. So it does take a little bit of time to get used to, but I found it to be beneficial in the long run because it does catch some things to make things standard. You can also do custom rules. I'm going to show you quickly how you can do a custom rule for that WCF issue that I found before. So first, I'm going to go back into the beers assembly, and I'm going to delete this global suppressions file. Code analysis creates this whenever you suppress any rules. I want to make sure that that's gone. Delete that. What are you deleting? That's odd. Usually it lets you delete that. There we go. Okay. So now if I recompile this project, which is where I got those first 4 errors from, it'll give you some things like you should mark it as CLS compliant, some other things, the things that BLATS is spelled wrong. You usually get acronyms in projects that are just specific to what you're doing. You can actually create a custom dictionary file. I have a reference in the slide deck that shows you how to do this across projects, so that these are actually not flagged as wrong. If you want something to say, no, this is okay, you don't have to keep telling me about it, you can highlight those, right click and say suppress. Project suppression file, that's where this comes from. It basically just adds a bunch of attributes in your code base so that when it runs code analysis, it doesn't flag those anymore. It does pick up that manufacturer is actually spelled wrong. Okay. Yeah, just double click on it. And it takes you right to basically that area of code where it's wrong. So if I change that back to saying rename, manufacturer, now if I recompile it, it succeeds. So it does a lot more than just catching naming, or misspelled words. It'll actually find things like you shouldn't throw an exception in a filing block. That's one thing that you shouldn't do for a lot of reasons. It'll catch stuff like that. I won't go through the details of how you can catch something for a one-way operation. How I did this custom rule, it will be in the code that's going to be available for download. It gets kind of deep into the code analysis API. But what's nice about it is that you can have a service here that places an order. I want 50 Newcastles, and this is done correctly. But if I change it so that it's a string, and change the implementation here so that it is a string, and I'm just going to say return null, just for brevity's sake. We compile this, I have this error coming up saying that this returns, operation returns system void. This is because my error message is really poorly written. But it picked this up because if I go into my project, this will also show you where it is. Code analysis is down at the bottom here. And this is where you can turn on all these different rules to see what you're following or not. My rules are actually turned on, and all the details of how you do this is in this other project. You also have to have this in a very specific location under Microsoft's Visual Studio directory under the program files. So that will pick up that you actually have custom rules that it can load. Not something that's very common because it's not documented that much at all in terms of how you do that. So I'm going to skip over the metrics one and I'll just end with this. A couple things. Some of these tools, like I talked about before, require a team edition, especially if you're in the 2005 version. They're not very extensible document or just easy to use. The code metrics that I didn't go over is not extensible at all. They just give you n number of code metrics and that's it. To write custom rules for code analysis is not easy. I have slides that I basically, or I have URLs in the slide deck that basically tell you how to do this, but it's from other sites that people kind of picked and pieced and parceled together to figure out how you do this. There are third-party alternatives, like I mentioned tonight. There's NUnit, NAND, NCover, which is a great tool. There's NDepend, which is a fabulous tool for static analysis. It's kind of like code analysis. Does some of the same things, but it has this language called CQL, which basically is SQL to interest vector assemblies. So it's an amazing tool. So there are definitely things that you can use. They're outside the Microsoft's world. There are advantages, like I mentioned, the integration is all out of the box when you install it. But either way, if you use Microsoft tools, if you use open source tools, follow the principles. Okay? Because at the end of the day, we all want to have better code. And have tools that drive this stuff and that's all automated, makes our lives easier. Automate those tools. Don't try to run all this stuff manually, even though I was doing it here. At the end of the day, you want to have like a continuous build server doing all this stuff for you. But run them. Run these tools, see what's missing in your code. Be open to criticism. If a tool tells you something's wrong, look at it and say, why is it telling me this? What am I doing wrong? As developers, I think we all have some tendencies to be a little bit, somebody tells us you're not doing this right, we get a little bit too much on the defensive at times. Okay? I don't think it's in our nature to take that criticism in and go, oh, okay, great, I'll change that. But the more I do this as a software developer, this is very beneficial to keeping in mind when somebody's giving me constructive criticism, try to take it. It may actually make things better. Care about what you do, it's a philosophical thing. I mean, if somebody just doesn't care about writing unit tests, it's hard to change that mindset. Sometimes it takes a really hard fail for them to go, maybe we should add unit tests. Maybe we should actually care about this stuff. And finally, if you notice, this is my A, B, C, D. The D is, do you want clear, consistent, and correct code? I think we all want that in all the projects we do. It just takes some time to not only get familiar with the tools, but to have a mindset that we just keep on doing this so that we can write better code. And then here at the end, I've got some references, Daily WTF, some books that I found very beneficial related to these tools and processes, and a bunch of articles that are related to the code analysis, dictionaries and writing rules, and so on. And that should be it. So are there any questions? All right, yeah, go ahead.
One thing I noticed you, obviously this is very focused on the tools in Visual Studio 2008, which is great. But in your core tenets at the beginning, you didn't have anything kind of related to documentation in your code, which is, to me, a very, very huge thing in writing good code, is explaining why you're doing something.
Yeah.
And especially documenting the business rules you're implementing as you go.
He's basically saying about, if I could add another bullet point, it would be documentation at the beginning of my slide. Again, like I said, people could all have their other bullet points to it as well. I'd actually, with document documentation, especially with XML comments and comments in general, I tend to be very lean on comments. Because I hope that the code that I actually write is very readable as it stands. Now, generally if you write a public API, especially if it's being consumed by other people, having those XML comments in there can be beneficial because Visual Studio's IDE can read those, give you the IntelliSense to say what exceptions you think is being thrown, things like that. But to me, comments can sometimes get to be a crutch and people can rely upon them too much. So
I agree with you that code should explain, and that your code should be pretty self-explanatory from the standpoint of what it is doing.
Yeah.
What it doesn't do to me is explain why it is doing that, and that's what I look for in comments from our team is the why. Because I can see what all day long.
Yeah.
I can review your code in a year and see what, but I can't see why. Especially as it relates to, again, the business stuff that you're implementing in a larger system.
You know, with documentation, I've always been not against it, but just make it as lean and dynamic as you possibly can because that documentation can get stale in a hurry. So, I'm going to be here all night. I have a room at this hotel, so I'm not going anywhere. So if you have any questions for me afterwards, feel free to ask me. Otherwise, thanks for having me here.